The document slid across the table and stopped in front of me. I looked at it the way I'd looked at 100 documents before it, the way you look at something when you already know it's going to cost you, and you're just trying to figure out how much. My father's handwriting was on the cover page. Travis's name was at the top. There was a number at the bottom with more zeros than I wanted to count. "Your brother needs help," my father said. I set down my fork. The table was still set for four, the good china my mother only brought out when she wanted something to feel normal. Candles burned at both ends of the centerpiece, the wax already half gone, and the dining room smelled the way the Murphy house always smelled on Sunday evenings: pot roast, furniture polish, something underneath it that was harder to name. I am Reagan Murphy. I was 34 years old, a senior paralegal at a litigation firm in Charlotte, and I had been fixing things for this family since I was 19. I knew what this meeting was before I sat down. I just didn't know it was the last one. "What exactly am I fixing this time?" I asked. The room went quiet, not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that happens right before something breaks. My father looked at me across the table. Noah Murphy, 62 years old, retired plant supervisor, a man who had spent his entire life believing that saying something loudly enough made it true. His jaw tightened. His hands, still flat on the tablecloth, pressed down like he was steadying himself. "Just looking at you," he said, "makes me sick." I heard my mother stop breathing. Across the table, Susan set down her wine glass with a small, careful click. My hands went still on either side of my plate. I didn't move them. I just felt them go still the way hands do when the rest of your body is deciding what to do next. "Excuse me?" I said. "You heard me." His voice was completely flat. No heat in it. That was the part that landed wrong. The flatness. Anger I could have worked with. This was something else. Every time I look at you, sitting there with your questions, your tone, your whole attitude, I'm done. I have been done. Susan shifted in her chair. I saw it from the corner of my eye. Not discomfort. She was getting comfortable. Reagan. My sister's voice was smooth as fresh paint. "Maybe you should pack your things." "Excuse me?" "Pack your things." She picked up her wine glass again. "Get out. Tonight." My mother stared at her plate. The candles kept burning. Nobody said a word. I looked at my father. He picked up the document I hadn't touched and slid it back toward himself without looking at me. Done. Conversation over, as if I were a contractor who'd quoted too high and he'd decided to go with someone else. The feeling in my chest was not sadness. It was not anger. It was something quieter and colder. The kind of thing you only recognize later when you have time to sit with it. At that moment, it just felt like the floor dropping an inch. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, pushed my chair back from the table. "Okay," I said. "No problem." My father refilled his water glass. Susan was already looking at her phone. My mother's shoulders were pulled up toward her ears the way they got when she was waiting for a storm to pass. Except this time, the storm was walking out of the room, so there was nothing left to wait for. I went upstairs. The guest room they called my room had been my room for 6 weeks, since my apartment lease ran out in October, and the new one didn't start until the 1st of December. 6 weeks with one bag in the corner, and my toiletries on the bathroom shelf, and the folder of documents I always kept with me in the nightstand drawer. Paralegal habit. I kept copies of everything I'd ever signed or processed for this family. Every form, every check, every authorization going back 11 years. I didn't know why I'd started doing it. I just had, and once I started, I never stopped. I took the folder out of the drawer, put it in the bag. Toothbrush, laptop, 3 changes of clothes, the charger I always kept coiled by the nightstand, my good coat from the closet, the folder. That was it. One bag. I zipped it and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the bed, the dresser, the window that faced the backyard. The Murphy house had 4 bedrooms. I had slept in this one every Christmas for my entire adult life. I had sat in the chair by this window when my grandmother was dying and I needed somewhere quiet. I picked up the bag and walked out. The hallway smelled like pot roast and candle smoke. Downstairs, the kitchen light was on. I could hear my father opening a cabinet, the clink of a glass, the particular sound of a bottle set down on a granite counter. Susan was at the kitchen table already, back to me, scrolling through something on her phone. Her shoulders relaxed in a way that made me understand she was not upset. My mother stood at the sink, washing dishes, her back turned. Nobody looked up. I walked to the front door, opened it, stepped out into the November cold, the air sharp enough to feel on the back of my throat. Closed the door behind me. Nobody followed. My car was in the driveway, parked behind Susan's. I put the bag in the back seat, got behind the wheel, and sat there with the engine off. 2 full minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard because I had nowhere to be and nothing to do, and I was trying to figure out what had just happened. Every light in the house was on. Through the living room window, I could see the blue-white glow of a phone screen and Susan's profile, laughing at something, still at the table, not concerned. The way you laugh when a problem has just walked out the door and solved itself. I started the car. Dana Orozco lived 20 minutes away, in a 2-bedroom apartment off Park Road she'd had for 6 years. We'd worked at the same firm for 4 desks 10 feet apart, and she was the only person who had ever said to my face what most people just thought, that I worked twice as hard as everyone else and gave away everything I earned. She'd said it once, 2 years ago, over a lunch. I barely had time to eat, and I'd laughed it off and changed the subject. She answered the door in socks and a worn sweatshirt, took one look at my face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. "Guest room's already made up," she said. "We'll talk in the morning." I walked past her into the hallway. Warm air. The smell of coffee from earlier in the day. Quiet that felt different from the quiet of the last 2 hours. This quiet was just quiet. I set my bag down by the door of the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed. My phone was in my pocket. I had not checked it since before dinner. I took it out now and looked at the screen. No messages, no calls. Not from my father, not from my mother, not from Susan. I thought about the mortgage auto pay I'd set up 3 years ago from my checking account. The family home. Noah's name on the deed. My money pulling automatically every month, the way it had been pulling for 3 years, the way I'd never once thought to stop. I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I didn't think about the auto pay again that night, but something in the back of my mind filed it away, the way I filed everything away, the way 11 years of keeping records had trained me to hold on to things I didn't yet understand. I just didn't know yet what I was holding. Dana's guest room had a window that faced east, which meant the light came in early whether you wanted it to or not. I woke up Monday morning to pale gray pressing through the curtains and lay there listening to the apartment around me, the particular silence of someone else's space, before I remembered why I was in it. My phone was on the nightstand. I picked it up before I was fully sitting upright, a reflex built over years of being the person people called when something went wrong. Nothing. Not from my father, not from my mother, not from Susan. The screen showed the time, 6:42, and a weather notification I didn't open, and a silence that was starting to have a texture. I set it face down and got up. Dana was already in the kitchen. She handed me coffee without asking how I'd slept, which told me she already knew, and I stood at the counter and drank it and looked at the pale November sky through her window. 20 minutes later, we were heading to the firm, neither of us saying much, and that was exactly what I needed. I had spent years sitting at my desk holding things together behind the scenes while attorneys got the credit. That Monday I answered emails, drafted a deposition summary, and ate half a container of yogurt at noon without tasting it. At 2 in the afternoon, I caught myself staring at my personal phone, face up, in the left corner of my desk, where I could see the screen without reaching for it, and I made myself look back at my monitor. They were giving me space. That was what I told myself. My father had said something ugly in a moment of frustration. By tonight or tomorrow, someone would call. At 5 o'clock, I checked the screen before leaving the building. Still nothing. We drove back in the same quiet. Dana didn't offer theories or comfort. She had known me long enough to understand what I needed. which was not to be talked at, and I had known her long enough to be grateful for that specific kind of restraint. After dinner, I sat on her living room floor with the folder I'd grabbed from the nightstand the night I left and started sorting. Paralegal habit. When I don't know what to do with something, I organize it. I make piles. I put things in order. The act of working through paper gives my hands something honest to do while the rest of me catches up. The folder was thicker than I'd remembered. 11 years of copies will do that. I had kept records of everything I'd ever signed or processed for my family, authorization forms, check images, wire transfer confirmations, correspondence with lenders, statements from accounts I had co-signed when my father said it would make things easier. I had kept all of it because keeping copies was as automatic for me as locking a car door. I did it without examining why. I sorted chronologically first, then by category: mortgage and property, general household, Travis related, other. It was the Travis related stack that made me slow down. Some of the checks I recognized: monthly contributions to what my father had called the household fund, amounts that had felt reasonable when I agreed to them and that I had not examined closely since. But there were also payments I could not immediately place. Checks drawn on my account, my signature at the bottom, cashed by entities whose names I did not recognize. A company name that sounded like a property management firm. A set of initials that told me nothing. The amounts were not small. I pulled Dana's legal pad from the end table and started writing them down. Every payment I could not match to a clear and documented purpose got its own line. The column grew faster than I expected. I stopped when I ran out of unambiguous entries and looked at what I had. Dana looked over from the couch. "What is it?" "Something doesn't add up," I said. She set her book down and came over and looked at the legal pad. "That's more than I'd expect," she said quietly. "A lot more," I said, and near the bottom of the Travis stack, tucked between a notarized form from 2 years ago and a letter I'd co-signed at my father's request without reading carefully enough, was a small white business card, clean typeface, a firm name I didn't recognize. Below it, in smaller print, a 2-word specialty: securities fraud defense. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. I held it between 2 fingers and looked at it while the apartment settled into its night quiet around me. I knew what those words meant. I spent my working days close to legal language. Securities fraud defense meant allegations involving investments and misrepresentation. It meant civil exposure at minimum. It meant the kind of case that required a specialist and a retainer large enough to matter. I set the card on the corner of the table where I would see it in the morning. Finished organizing the folder. Wrote unknown next to every entry I couldn't account for, and looked at how many unknowns I had. Then I thought about my brother's real estate projects, always almost done, investors always almost committed, deals always about to close. I told myself there was an explanation. There was almost always an explanation. I slept badly and woke before the light came and lay in the gray until it was time to find out what the card meant. Dana had left for an early meeting when I sat down at her kitchen table with my laptop and the card propped against the monitor base. The coffee was fresh. Outside, Tuesday pressed down low and colorless against the skyline. The firm's website was sparse, the way white-collar defense practices always are. 3 partners, 2 associates, a practice area list that led with securities litigation. I found one of the named partners quoted in a legal trade journal from 16 months ago, discussing civil fraud cases involving real estate investment structures. I went to the public court filing database I used at work and typed in my brother's full name. The result came back in 11 seconds. A civil complaint, 43 pages, filed 14 months ago in Mecklenburg County. 6 individual plaintiffs and 1 corporate entity. The allegation was clear in the way catastrophic things often are. When reduced to legal language, Travis had solicited investment funds for a real estate development project that never broke ground. The money had moved through a series of entities and was substantially unaccounted for. Fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. The filing date was 14 months ago. I sat back and looked at the ceiling. Then I looked at my wire transfer confirmations. The first large transfer I'd made at my father's request had occurred 13 months and 3 weeks ago. He had told me it was for a property tax shortfall. I had transferred the money, kept the confirmation, and not examined the destination account information closely enough to ask what it actually was. I pulled up the confirmation and found the routing and account numbers. Then I opened the complaints exhibit list and started scrolling through the attached financial records. 9 minutes later, I found the match. The account that received my wire was associated with a limited liability company listed in the complaints exhibits as one of the entities through which investor funds had moved. The company had been registered in North Carolina 31 months ago. It appeared in my own records twice more, connected to the second and third transfers my father had requested over the following 12 months. I wrote that on a clean page of the legal pad and underlined it once. My father had known about Travis's lawsuit for at least 14 months. He had come to me for money during that entire window. He had called it property taxes, contractor fees, household needs. He had given me account numbers, and I had trusted them because trusting them was easier than asking what they were for. I thought about the dinner table. Your brother needs help. How many times I had handled it and gone back to whatever I was doing without thinking about it again. My mother at the sink with her back turned. I already knew how to do what came next, tracing money, reading complaint exhibits, building a timeline that held. I had been doing that for other people's cases for 11 years. The only difference now was that this one was mine. I picked up my pen and started, entry by entry, without looking away. The spreadsheet I built that evening had 4 columns: date, description, amount, and a 4th column I labeled source, where I wrote down exactly what my father had told me each payment was for. I worked from Dana's kitchen table while she moved quietly around the apartment behind me, making tea, reading, not asking questions. The folder was spread across the table in organized stacks, and I went through each one methodically logging every entry cross, referencing amounts against the civil complaints timeline, matching dates to requests my father had made by phone or text over the past 14 months. By 11 o'clock, I had enough to see the shape of it clearly. At least 60% of what I had transferred to the account connected to Travis's defense could not be reconciled with the purposes I'd been given. The amounts matched the pattern of payments to the securities fraud firm too closely for the closeness to be coincidental. My father had managed the flow with precision. He had spaced the requests far enough apart that none of them had felt alarming on its own. He had always had a reason ready, something domestic and unglamorous: property taxes, a contractor, something with the gutters, the kind of thing you don't argue with because arguing with it makes you sound like you don't care about the house. I wrote the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet column, then looked at it for a long moment, then wrote it again on the legal pad because writing it twice made it harder to dismiss. I had not been helping my family. I had been funding the legal containment of my brother's fraud. I closed the laptop and sat with that for a while in the quiet of the kitchen. The next morning I thought about the dinner, specifically about Susan. Not what she had said, but what she had been doing while she said it. I had been too shaken in the moment to register it clearly, but sitting at Dana's table with coffee and 2 days of distance, the image came back with more detail. Susan had been texting under the table during the confrontation, not casual scrolling. This was deliberate, focused, her thumbs moving with the particular speed of someone composing something, sending it, waiting, responding. I had not thought anything of it at the time because there had been so much else demanding my attention. Now I thought about it. My mother had mentioned once, in passing the way she mentioned things she didn't want to make into a real topic, that Susan and Travis talked every day. Not occasionally, every day. The kind of frequency that implied not a sibling relationship so much as an operational one. 2 people coordinating something ongoing, checking in on a shared project. I thought about the timing of Susan's words at the dinner. Pack your things. Get out. Tonight. Said not with anger, but with the ease of someone delivering a line they had already considered. said right after my father's outburst, like a follow-through, a punctuation mark. I thought about who she might have been texting. I wrote Susan on the legal pad and drew a line connecting it to Travis and sat looking at the diagram for a while. I could not prove anything from a recollection of watching her thumbs move under the table. But I had learned, working cases, that the things you notice in the moment and dismiss are often the things that matter later, once you have enough context to understand what you were actually seeing. I added Susan's text thread to my mental list of things to keep track of and moved on. That same morning, I found myself thinking about something else. Years ago, before any of this, my mother had called me with a particular hesitance in her voice that meant she was about to ask for something she wasn't sure she was entitled to ask. She had wanted help setting up a small savings account. Just for emergencies, she had said. Just in case. She had been vague about what the emergency might look like, and I had not pushed her, because there were things my mother communicated only in the space around her actual words. I had helped her fill out the forms, had driven her to the bank on a Saturday, had sat beside her while she signed the paperwork. After that, I had never heard her mention it again. I filed it away now, the way I filed everything, and went back to what I could prove. That evening, Dana and I talked later than we usually did. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I walked her through what I had built over the past 2 days. She listened without interrupting, tracking the logic of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me the question I had been avoiding. "How much of what you gave them," she said carefully, "actually went where they said it went?" I looked at the spreadsheet, the column labeled source with its entries about property taxes and contractors and household needs. Every one of them now sitting next to a payment I could trace to a destination that had nothing to do with any of those things. "Almost none of it," I said. "For the last 14 months, almost none of it." She nodded. She didn't say she was sorry, which I appreciated. Sympathy would have made it softer, and I didn't need it softer. I needed it to stay exactly as hard and clear as it was. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. "Build a complete file," I said. "Every payment, every document, everything I can match to the complaint and everything I can't. Not to sue them." I paused. "They're going to tell me I'm making it up. When that happens, I want to have 80 pages that say I'm not." Dana looked at the folder and then at me. "That's the most paralegal thing I've ever heard you say." "It's the most paralegal situation I've ever been in," I said. She almost smiled. I almost did too. The rain that had started during dinner was still going outside, steady and unremarkable. After a while, Dana said goodnight and went down the hall, and I stayed at the table alone with the papers for another hour. I thought about what it meant that my mother had not called. 3 days now. She had never in my adult life gone 4 days without some kind of contact. She had been standing at the sink when I walked out, her back turned, her shoulders held carefully still. She knew. Not everything, maybe, but she had been living in that house for 34 years, and she was not a stupid woman. She had chosen to stay at the sink. I understood that. I did not forgive it yet, but I understood it. I finally closed the folder and turned off the kitchen light and went to the guest room. Outside, the rain kept falling. I lay in the dark and thought about the savings account my mother had opened on a quiet Saturday, the one with the small deposit she had never mentioned again, just for emergencies. I wondered what kind of emergency she had been preparing for. I wondered if she had known, even then, that a day like this one was coming, and had made herself one thread that wasn't tangled up in everything else. I fell asleep thinking about that, and I filed it away, careful and precise, in the place in my mind where I kept the things I would need later. By the 5th day, I had a complete map, not a guess, not a theory, a documented, cross-referenced, entry-by-entry account of where $211,000 had gone over 11 years, and specifically where the last 14 months of it had gone and what it had paid for, and what it had not paid for, and the gap between those two things was not a rounding error or a misunderstanding. It was a decision someone had made, deliberately, over a sustained period of time, using my trust as the mechanism. I spread the full timeline across Dana's kitchen floor because the table wasn't big enough. 11 years of entries in chronological order, left to right. The first years were straightforward, small amounts, things that matched what I'd been told. Then the pattern changed, the amounts climbed, the destinations became less legible. The purposes my father had given me became more vague and more domestic at the same time, as if he had understood that the more ordinary something sounded, the less likely I was to ask follow-up questions. He had understood that correctly. At least 60% of what I had transferred in the 14 months following Travis's lawsuit filing had gone into entities connected to his legal defense. The remainder was split between the actual mortgage and a handful of smaller payments I couldn't fully trace. The legitimate amounts were real. They just were not the whole story. They were the layer of truth my father had laid on top of everything else to make the rest look like more of the same. I thought about the phrase, "your brother needs help." How many times I had heard it. How many times it had arrived with just enough urgency to bypass my better judgment and just enough normalcy to not trigger alarm. I thought about the tone my father used when he said it, not quite desperate, not quite casual, something calibrated in between, the tone of a man who had practiced asking for something until the asking no longer looked like what it was. I thought about Travis, sending requests through my father the way you route something through a server you trust not to flag it. I wrote the total one more time on a clean page and looked at it. $211,000. Give or take what I still couldn't fully trace. I put the page at the front of the file. Dana came into the kitchen, looked at the floor, looked at me, and stepped carefully over the pages to get to the coffee maker. "Day 3, day 4, she said. "Nothing?" "Nothing," I said. She poured her coffee and looked at the papers on the floor. "Noah said she'd be back by Friday." I looked up at her. "I ran into your mom's neighbor at the grocery store last year," Dana said. "She mentioned things. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business." She paused. "Your father has been saying for years that you always come back." I looked back down at the floor. The timeline spread from one end of the kitchen to the other. $211,000. 11 years. And my father, somewhere in the Murphy house right now, waiting for Friday. "Travis texted," I said. "It wasn't a question." "Probably," Dana said. "Get her to sign the papers." I said it the way I imagined Travis had typed it. Efficient. Transactional. The way you talk about a process, not a person. Dana sat down at the table with her coffee and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I gathered the pages from the floor carefully, in order, and put them back in the folder. Then I sat on the edge of Dana's couch and let myself feel what I had been, not feeling for 5 days, not performing any particular kind of composure for anyone, not processing it into something useful, just sitting with it the way you have to eventually sit with things you have been too busy to be devastated by. I had believed I was the one who kept things together. I had spent 11 years building a story about myself in which being the responsible one was the same thing as being valued. And that story had been so old and so structural that I had never once examined the foundation it was sitting on. It had not occurred to me to examine it because the story felt true from the inside. It felt like love. Not the affectionate kind, maybe. Not the kind that called just to talk, but the functional kind. The kind that says you matter because look at how much we need you. I had needed to matter to them, and they had known that. They had always known that. They had used it with the casual expertise of people who have never had to think about it because it has simply always worked. I thought about the dinner table. Not the words alone, but the moment before them, when my father slid the document across the table toward me. The assumption so complete it didn't require an ask, just a gesture. "Sign this. Handle it. Do what you do." And then, when I asked one question, "What exactly am I fixing this time?" his face had changed, not into anger, but into something that looked like exposure. The look of a man who has been moving confidently in a dark room and suddenly felt the furniture shift. I had not been supposed to ask. The first time I cried was on the 5th night. sitting on the edge of Dana's guest room bed with the full timeline spread across the floor in the other room and the total written on the page at the front, and my phone on the nightstand with no messages on it, not from anger. The anger was coming, but it wasn't here yet. This was something underneath the anger, the specific grief of understanding that the version of yourself you have been living inside for 11 years was never quite the shape you thought it was. I had been the family's infrastructure, not its daughter, not in any way that cost them anything. I cried quietly for about 20 minutes, the way you do when you have been holding something in the correct position for too long and your arms simply give out. Then I heard Dana's door open softly down the hall in her footsteps, and she came in and sat on the edge of the bed beside me without turning on the light and without saying anything. She put her hand on the blanket near mine and left it there. After a long time, I said, "I don't even know what I've been fixing." Dana didn't answer. There wasn't an answer to it. That was the point. The question wasn't looking for a response. It was looking for room to exist, which was different, and Dana understood that difference. We sat there until I stopped, and then a little while after that, in the dark, in the quiet of someone else's apartment that had started to feel more like safety than anywhere else did. Outside, cars moved down the street below. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary night in a city that did not know or care what had just come apart. I thought about my mother. 5 days now and nothing. I had pulled up her contact that afternoon, thumb hovering, not quite pressing it, not quite putting it down. The not calling was not easy. It was the hardest one, but it was still a choice I was making, and that was different from what it had been before, when the not asking was something that simply happened to me. Eventually, Dana said goodnight and went back to her room, and I lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular weight of the bottom, which is not dramatic when you are actually in it. It is just very quiet and very clear. This was the bottom. I knew it the way you know it when you have stopped performing okayness for yourself as well as for everyone else. And knowing where the bottom was meant I could also know, for the first time in 5 days, which direction was up. I woke up the next morning before the light came in, not from a dream, not from a sound, just from the particular alertness of a body that has finished with sleep and moved on without asking permission. I lay there for a few minutes in the gray, listening to the apartment, to Dana's coffee maker clicking on in the kitchen on its timer, to the muffled sound of traffic 6 floors below, to the specific quiet of a morning that had not yet asked anything of me. Then I got up. I showered with the water hotter than I normally ran it, and stood under it long enough that the mirror was completely fogged when I stepped out. I dried off and dressed for work and did these things with the deliberate attention of someone who is relearning how to move through the basic facts of her own day. Shoes, keys, watch, the small anchoring inventory of a person deciding to stay upright. Dana was in the kitchen in her robe when I came out. She looked at me the way she sometimes looked at exhibits in complicated cases, reading without commenting, taking in what was there. I sat down at the table, put both hands around the mug she set in front of me. "I'm not going back," I said. She poured her own coffee, sat down across from me. "I'm not fixing it," I said. "I'm not explaining why." She looked at me for a moment, not surprised. Not relieved either, exactly, just present. "What do you need?" she asked. I thought about the binder I hadn't built yet, the files I had organized, but not assembled into the single coherent document I was going to need when my family sat across from me and told me I was confused, or mistaken, or making things up, which I knew they would do because that was the move I had watched them make my entire life whenever reality became inconvenient. "A printer," I said. "And about 2 hours." Dana nodded, like this was completely reasonable, which it was, and that was one of the things I had always valued about her. I went to work, I answered my emails and handled the Hargrove deposition prep, and ate a full lunch, not half of something at my desk, but an actual lunch at the table in the break room, because I was rebuilding something, and the rebuilding started with keeping myself fed and upright and functioning. Small decisions made deliberately. The opposite of the last 11 years, which had been large sacrifices made automatically, without examination. At 5 o'clock, I packed up and went back to Dana's apartment and sat down at her kitchen table with her laptop and my bank account open on the screen. The mortgage autopay had been running for 3 years. My account, pulling on the 15th of every month, steady and invisible, the way all automatic payments are invisible once you stop thinking about them. The next pull was 6 days away. I found the payee in the recurring payments list, clicked into the settings. I sat there for a moment with my cursor on the cancel option, not from hesitation, from the strange compression of it. The fact that something that had taken years to build could be stopped with one click on a Saturday evening. I thought about how many times I had sat at a different kitchen table in a different apartment and made the opposite kind of decision without thinking about it at all. How automatic the giving had been. How invisible. I clicked cancel. The confirmation screen loaded. Payment canceled. Effective immediately. I looked at it for a moment and then scrolled down to the recurring transfer section. My father's account, labeled Family Fund in my payment portal, had been pulling $3,200 every single month for 2 years. I had set it up at his request. He had given me the account number over the phone, and I had entered it without writing it down first, the way you enter information you don't expect to question later. I canceled that too. A second confirmation appeared. The screen was very plain about it. 2 transactions, 2 confirmations, 11 years of a pattern, stopped in the space of 4 minutes on a Saturday. I got a post-it note from the drawer where Dana kept office supplies and wrote the number on it. $3,200 per month, not counting the mortgage, not counting the wire transfers, not counting 11 years of smaller amounts I had written off one at a time as helping because helping was what responsible daughters did. Just the monthly number. The one that had been leaving my account so consistently it had stopped feeling like a choice. I stuck the post-it to the corner of the laptop screen and looked at it for a minute. Then I looked away. The binder came next. Dana had a box of legal-sized folders, a working printer, and enough paper for what I needed. I connected my laptop to the printer and started pulling files. Every payment document, chronological order first, every wire transfer confirmation, the civil complaint, all 43 pages. The shell company registration records I had pulled from the North Carolina Secretary of State database. The exhibit matches I had built in the spreadsheet, cross-referenced and annotated so that anyone reading them could follow the chain without needing a legal background. And a one-page timeline I had drafted by hand the night before, in language clean enough that any reasonably intelligent adult could understand it without asking what a limited liability company was. I punched holes and filed. Dana came home while I was assembling the last 30 pages and sat down across from me and started helping without being asked, sorting the printed sheets into the correct order while I handled the binder rings. "This is the most paralegal thing you've ever done," she said. "I know," I said. "That's the point." She almost smiled. I almost did too. Not a full smile, not yet, but the shape of one. The first one in 6 days. I set the completed binder on the corner of the table when we were done. 87 pages, tabbed and indexed. Every number sourced. Every claim supported by at least 2 documents. I put my hands flat on top of it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was real and solid in a way that the last 6 days had mostly not been. Paper. Evidence. The thing I had been trained to build for other people's lives, now built for my own. This was not a weapon, I reminded myself. I was not going to court. I was not seeking legal remedy against my own family, not because they didn't deserve it, but because the law was slow and public and exhausting, and what I needed was not a judgment. What I needed was to never again sit across from my father while he told me I was making things up and have nothing in my hands. This binder was the answer to that. This was what it looked like when the responsible one finally kept copies for herself. My phone was on the counter. I had turned it face down that morning and not touched it since. I picked it up now and looked at the screen. Day 6. Not a word from my father, not from Travis, who apparently could not be moved to contact me directly even now. My mother had not called. I sat with the quiet of that for a moment. 6 days was a long time by Murphy family standards. My mother had never in my adult life gone more than a few days without some kind of contact, even if it was just a forwarded recipe or a two-line text about the weather. The silence from her carried a different weight than the silence from my father or my sister. Theirs felt strategic. Hers felt like something she was being held in. I thought about her at the sink on Sunday night, her back turned, the water running, her shoulders pulled up toward her ears. She had been in that posture my entire life. I had never once seen her step out of it. I put the phone back down, face up this time. Not because I was ready for them, because I was done managing what I was ready for. I cooked dinner that night at Dana's stove. Something simple, pasta and a sauce I made from the canned tomatoes she kept in the cabinet. And while I cooked, I thought about the fact that I had not cooked in 6 days. I had been feeding myself the way you feed yourself when you are waiting for something to resolve. Now I stood at the stove and stirred the sauce, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil and something approaching ordinary, and I let that be enough for the moment. Dana came and stood in the doorway and watched me for a second. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I said. She nodded and went to set the table, and we ate dinner together in the kind of quiet that no longer felt like waiting. The bank notice arrived the following Thursday. I didn't see it, of course. My name wasn't on the deed. My name had never been on the deed, which had suited everyone perfectly for 3 years, because it meant my father could refer to the house as his without any technical inaccuracy, while the account funding its mortgage was entirely mine. The notice went to the Murphy house on Fieldstone Drive, addressed to Noah Murphy, and arrived on a Thursday morning while I was at my desk in South End, reviewing deposition exhibits and eating an apple I had actually remembered to pack. I found out about it later. I found out about most of what happened inside the Murphy house during those 7 days later, pieced together from things my mother eventually told me, and things that became visible through other means. And I will tell it the way I came to know it, which was not all at once. The notice was automated, the kind of letter banks send when a payment that has been running predictably for years suddenly stops. It was not yet a default notice, not technically, not at that stage. It was a courtesy, a flag, a piece of paper that said something has changed and we thought you should know. My father opened it at the kitchen table on Thursday morning and read it twice and then set it face down on the table and sat there for a while. He had no savings to cover the payment. This was the part he had never needed to think about before, because the payment had always cleared before he thought about it. Reagan handled it. Reagan had always handled it. The money appeared the way utilities appear when you have never had to think about where they come from. And now it had stopped appearing, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a face-down letter and no contingency. He picked up his phone. He looked at my name and his contacts. He put the phone back down. She said later he seemed to believe I would call first. That I always had. By Friday, Travis's defense attorney had called the Murphy house directly. The next settlement payment to the Investors' Council was overdue. There were timetables. There were consequences for missing timetables. My mother told me later that my father paced the kitchen that Friday evening, his phone in his hand, picking it up and putting it back down. She said he seemed certain I would call first. That I always had, that this time would be no different. He did not call. While the Murphy house ran its calculations, I was doing something I hadn't done in years, which was nothing I hadn't chosen. On Thursday evening, I went for a walk along the greenway near Dana's apartment and didn't take my phone. 40 minutes in the November cold, the trees stripped down to their shapes, the path mostly empty, my breath visible in front of me. I thought about nothing in particular. I noticed the cold on my face and the sound of my own footsteps and a jogger who passed me going the other direction and didn't look up. On Friday I left work at exactly 5 o'clock, not at 6:30 or 7, the way I had been leaving for years, accumulating extra hours, the way you accumulate debt invisibly, in increments that feel manageable until you add them up. I went back to Dana's and made tea, and sat on the couch and read 40 pages of a novel I had bought 3 months ago and never opened. Dana ordered takeout. We watched something on television that I didn't have to explain to anyone or justify or fit around someone else's schedule. On Friday night, late, I picked up my phone and opened my mother's contact. Her name on the screen, the one photo I had of her saved there, taken at a birthday lunch 2 years ago where she had looked genuinely happy for about 20 minutes before my father arrived. My thumb hovered over the call button, stayed there. I thought about what I would say if she picked up, and what she would say back, and what would be different afterward and what would not be. And after a while, I set the phone face down on the coffee table and went to bed. The not calling was a choice. That was what was different. Before, the not asking had been a condition I lived in, something I had absorbed so completely it no longer registered as a decision. I had grown up in a house where asking the wrong question was a kind of betrayal, where needing something was weakness, where the only safe role was the one that required nothing back. I had played that role for 34 years and called it love. This was a decision, something I was making with full knowledge of what it cost. I could feel the difference in the weight of it. Saturday came and, with it, Susan's calls. The first one arrived at 10 in the morning. I was making coffee when the phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Susan's name on the screen. Susan in a sundress at a winery 2 summers ago, smiling the smile she saved for cameras. I watched the screen cycle through its rings and go dark. She calls again at 11:45 and again at 2 in the afternoon. I let all three go. The voicemails were short enough to tell me everything I needed to know about how she was experiencing this week. The first one was almost reasonable. "You're overreacting. Dad didn't mean it. Just come home and sort this out." The second one had an edge under the reasonable surface. "This is getting ridiculous, Reagan. People are stressed." The third one had dropped the pretense entirely. "This is ridiculous. You're being selfish." I saved all three voicemails without listening to them twice. The saving was automatic, a paralegal habit, the same habit that had built me a folder full of documents that were now 87 pages of organized evidence sitting on the corner of Dana's kitchen table. Everything went into the record. Everything. Sunday afternoon, day 7. I was cooking dinner, actually cooking, pasta sauce from scratch, the sauce on the stove and the kitchen warm and smelling like garlic and olive oil. The afternoon light came through Dana's window at the angle it had in November, low and sideways, turning the kitchen a particular shade of gold. My phone was on the counter. It lit up at 4:17. My father's name on the screen. I looked at it. The sauce needed stirring. I stirred it. The phone kept ringing. I watched my father's name glow and dim as the call went to voicemail. He did not leave a message. 4:22, my mother. I turned the burner down a fraction and watched the screen. Her name, her photo, the birthday lunch, the 20 minutes of genuine happiness. The call rang out. 4:31, Susan again. 4:48, Travis. The first time he had called me directly in months, maybe longer. His name on my screen had the quality of something that should have felt significant, and instead just felt like the last item on a list. Dana looked up from her laptop and looked at the phone and then at me. "You okay?" she asked. I turned the phone face down on the counter, picked up the wooden spoon, checked the sauce. "I'm cooking," I said. The phone lit up one more time at 5:03, my mother again, and I watched the counter glow faintly through the back of the phone and kept stirring. Kept my eyes on the pot, kept my hands on the task in front of me. The call rang out. The counter went dark. I served the pasta at 5:15, and we sat down and ate, and the kitchen was quiet in a way that had become, over the last 7 days, something I was learning to recognize, not as absence, but as space, my own space, for the first time in a long time, mine. My mother called from a number I didn't recognize on Monday morning. I almost didn't pick up. Unknown numbers usually meant something work-related, and I had a deposition summary due by noon, and my phone had been a source of mostly grief for the past week, and my instinct was to let it go to voicemail and check it at lunch. But something made me answer before I had finished deciding to. "Reagan." My mother's voice, lower than usual, compressed in the way it got when she was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be calling from. "Please don't hang up." I didn't say anything. "I know," she said. "I know I should have called before now. I'm calling from Janet Pruitt's phone. I didn't want you to see my name and not pick up." Janet Pruitt was our neighbor on Fieldstone Drive. Had been for 20 years. My mother had stood in Janet Pruitt's driveway once in a bathrobe to wave goodbye to me when I left for college. And this was the detail my brain offered me while I stood in the parking lot outside my firm with my coffee going cold in my other hand. "I'm not asking you to come back," my mother said. "I'm not calling about the house or about your father or about any of that. I just need to know if you're all right." "I'm all right," I said. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, careful and even, the way she breathed when she was trying not to cry in front of someone. "I need to see you," she said. "Not at the house. Wherever you want, whenever you want. Just somewhere." I thought about the binder on Dana's kitchen table. I thought about 87 pages and 43 pages of civil complaint and routing numbers that matched exhibit entries. I thought about the fact that I had agreed to nothing yet, and the conversation I was about to have in a coffee shop in Dilworth would require every bit of the composure I had been building for the past 8 days. "Tuesday," I said. "The coffee shop on East Boulevard, 11 o'clock. A pause. "Okay," she said. "Reagan, Tuesday," I said again. 11. I hung up and stood in the parking lot for a moment with the cold November air on my face. Then I went back inside and finished the deposition summary. They were all there when I arrived. I had known they might be. My mother would have told my father because my mother always told my father, and my father would have told Susan, and one of them would have contacted Travis, and this was the Murphy family approach to a problem, which was to assemble in force and present a unified front and hope that the presence of the whole was enough to override the objections of any individual part. I had been an individual part my entire life. I understood the tactic from the inside. I walked in carrying the binder and ordered a coffee at the counter before I went to the table, because arriving composed and unhurried was the first statement I was going to make, and I intended to make it clearly. Noah was already performing. He sat at the head of the table, the way he sat at the head of every table, spine straight, hands flat, the posture of a man who has decided in advance that the situation is under control. "We're glad you came to your senses," he said when I sat down. I put the binder on the table. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. I looked at my father and did not respond. He took the silence as an opening and started with the script. "We're family. Families go through difficult periods. Your brother is in a situation and he needs our support, and that's what families do. They support each other. And surely now that I'd had some time to think, I could see that." The speech had the quality of something practiced, the sentences fitting together with a smoothness that meant he had run through it at least a few times before sitting down. I let him finish. Travis sat to his right, his face composed in the expression of a man waiting to see which way something was going to land before he committed to a reaction. Susan had her hands in her lap and her jaw set at the angle that meant she had already decided this was going to be fine. My mother sat at the far end of the table and looked at her coffee cup. When my father finished, I opened the binder. I set the one-page timeline on the table first, then the spreadsheet. Then, one at a time, the payment records, each one placed with the precision of someone who has done document work for 11 years and understands that the sequence matters. That the story you tell with paper has to build in a way that doesn't allow for the exit of pretending you didn't see it. "That's not what happened," my father said before I was halfway through. I placed the civil complaint on the table beside the spreadsheet. The routing number exhibit sat on top. I had highlighted the matching account numbers in both documents with a yellow marker because I was a paralegal, and I understood that some things needed to be visible even to people who do not want to see them. "This is exactly what happened," I said. Travis went the color of old concrete. His hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to his lap where I couldn't see them. Susan's jaw tightened further, but she didn't speak. My father tried to interrupt again, and I put the third exhibit on the table and kept going quietly without raising my voice, working through the timeline the way I would work through a deposition summary, point by point. Every figure sourced, every date confirmed. My mother picked up the complaint and started reading. Her hands began to shake after the second page. Not a lot, just enough. The particular tremor of someone who is encountering information they have been arranging not to encounter, and finding that the arrangement has been overridden. She set the complaint down. She looked at my father. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You knew?" she said. "All this time, you knew?" My father looked at her. Something moved across his face that I could not fully read. Not guilt, exactly, something older than guilt. The expression of a man whose structure has just been examined in full light for the first time, and found to be less sound than he had believed. "Mom told me you and Travis were texting during that dinner," I said. "I said it to the table in general, not to anyone specifically, the way you introduce a fact rather than an accusation." "While Dad was talking, you were texting Travis." Susan's face confirmed it before she could arrange it into anything else. Just for a second, less than a second, the confirmation was there. My mother saw it too. I closed the binder. I looked at my father. I had thought about what I wanted to say in this moment, and in the end I had not prepared a speech, because I had found over the past 8 days that the most truthful things I had said had been the ones that arrived without preparation. "You said looking at me makes you sick," I said. "You know what makes me sick? 11 years of being your bank account and being told it was love." I stood up. Travis said my name, just my name, with the inflection of someone who has identified a procedural problem and wants to address it before it escalates. "Reagan, if you walk away now," he started. "I walked away 8 days ago," I said. "You just didn't notice until the money stopped." I left the binder on the table, picked up my coat, walked to the door of the coffee shop and pushed it open. And the cold November air came in against my face the same way it had in the parking lot outside my firm, and the same way it had in the driveway of the Murphy house 8 days earlier. And I let it. The door closed behind me with the same quiet it always had. I did not look back. The weeks that followed had a texture I didn't expect. I had expected aftermath to feel dramatic, or at least definitive, the way endings feel in the version of stories where everything resolves cleanly and the last scene leaves you with no loose threads. What I got instead was slower and quieter than that, more granular. A series of small things arriving one at a time over the course of weeks, each one landing with a weight that was proportional not to its size but to what it meant. The first thing I heard about was the mortgage. Dana had a contact at a property records firm she used for research, and in the weeks following the coffee shop meeting, I started paying attention to things I had previously ignored. The Murphy House mortgage went into formal default 31 days after I canceled the auto pay. The bank sent a notice, then a second notice. My father attempted to refinance, which I learned through Dana's contact, and was denied because his retirement income could not support the loan on its own, had never been able to support the loan on its own, and the lender reviewing the application found nothing in his financial history to suggest otherwise. The house that 4 generations of Murphys had lived in, that my father had referred to as his for as long as I could remember, was moving toward foreclosure because the person who had actually been paying for it had stopped. I sat with that for a few days before I could look at it without feeling something complicated behind my sternum. Not satisfaction. Not grief, exactly. Something in between. The feeling you get when evidence you built in a binder becomes a physical consequence, happening to physical people in a house on a street in Charlotte. Travis's name appeared in the Charlotte Business Journal 3 weeks after the coffee shop meeting. A brief item in the legal notices section, the kind of thing most people scroll past. The civil complaint had moved into active litigation once the settlement payments stopped. The case was now public record, his name attached to it in print in a city where his reputation as a developer was the only currency he had left. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived, handwritten on my mother's stationery, 4 paragraphs, the word reconsider, appearing 3 times. He did not specify what he was asking me to reconsider, as if the specific request mattered less than the general outcome of me reversing whatever I had done that had caused things to become inconvenient. I read it once. I put it in the recycling bin next to Dana's kitchen counter. I did not feel guilty about the recycling bin. Susan's attempts were more frequent and less formal. A text arrived 10 days after the coffee shop. I didn't know it was that bad, it said. I sat with that one for longer than I wanted to admit, not because I was moved by it, but because of what it revealed. Not that bad implied a scale, a threshold, something she had known about and considered acceptable, until it crossed a line she had drawn privately and never announced. She had known some version of the truth. She had chosen the side that required knowing and staying quiet, and now that the consequences had arrived, she was repositioning herself as someone who simply hadn't had the full picture. I read the text 3 times. I did not reply. My father called 4 more times over the following weeks, each call from the same number, each one going to voicemail, each voicemail playing out its full length in my phone's storage without my ears ever receiving it. I didn't delete them. I didn't listen to them. I filed them in the same place I filed everything, in a category labeled "Not Yet," which was different from never and different from soon. And then my mother called. 3 weeks after the coffee shop, on a Thursday evening in December, my phone lit up with her name and I picked up. She didn't ask for anything. That was the first thing I noticed. The absence of the ask. The way the call didn't have the particular shape of a call that is building toward a request. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She didn't invoke my father, or Travis, or the house, or any of the architecture of the Murphy family's ongoing emergency. She said, I should have said something at that dinner table. I should have said something at every dinner before that one. I was sitting on Dana's couch with a cup of tea and the novel I had been reading in 20-page increments since the week I left, and I held the phone against my ear and looked at the window and the December dark beyond it and didn't say anything for a long moment. Yes, I said finally, you should have. She didn't argue with that. She didn't explain it or contextualize it or offer the 34 years of reasons she had for doing what she had done. She just received it, the way someone receives a true thing they have known and not said. She told me she was going to stay with her sister in Asheville for a while. Her sister Carol had a house with a spare room and had been asking her to visit for years, and she had finally said yes. She had the money for the bus ticket, she said, and she had a little put aside for expenses. I thought about a Saturday morning years ago, a bank branch off of Providence Road, my mother in her good coat sitting beside me while I helped her fill out the account opening forms. Just for emergencies, she had said. I had set it up and helped her make the first deposit and had not thought about it again for years. The savings account, I said. Yes, she said. I felt something shift in my chest, not the floor-giving out feeling of the earlier weeks, but something smaller and more specific, like a door opening onto a room that had been closed for a long time. Not forgiveness, not yet, not in full, but the first condition of forgiveness, which is believing that the person across from you is capable of choosing differently than they have chosen before. Okay, I said. Reagan, she said. I know, I said. We stayed on the line for a moment longer, neither of us speaking. The connection opened between us in the way that matters when words have run out, but the conversation hasn't. Then she said goodbye, and I said goodbye, and the call ended, and I sat on Dana's couch in the December quiet and held the phone in my lap and thought about Asheville, which was 2 hours west, which was not the same as being in the Murphy house on Fieldstone Drive, which was not nothing. 3 months after the Sunday dinner, I moved into my own apartment, 1 bedroom in Noda Charlotte's Arts District, the neighborhood north of downtown where the coffee shops had mismatched furniture and the walls of the bars were covered in paintings by people whose names you could look up if you wanted to. My windows faced a courtyard with a fig tree that had dropped all its leaves for the winter, but that the building manager told me would come back in the spring, and I had believed him because it was the kind of thing I wanted to believe. The apartment was smaller than anything I had lived in since my 20s. I did not mind the smallness. I had lived for 11 years in a version of myself that was too large, expanded by obligation and guilt, and the inflation that happens when you make yourself responsible for things that were never yours to carry. The small apartment fit the truer version of me that I was in the process of finding. I adopted a cat 2 weeks after moving in, Gray, with very specific opinions about where she was and was not permitted to be, which I found clarifying. I named her after no one. I got a raise in January. My supervisor told me I had been underpaid relative to my experience level for at least 2 years, which I had known and not addressed because addressing it had required energy. I had been routing elsewhere. I accepted the raise and thanked her, and went back to my desk and sat for a moment before I opened the next file. Dana came over for dinner on Fridays. She brought wine and I cooked. Simple things. The pasta sauce I had learned to make without thinking about it. A roast chicken I had started making on Sundays and eating through the week. The meals were not complicated. The apartment was quiet in the evenings. I read more than I had in years. I slept without the particular vigilance that had been my version of rest for longer than I had realized. The binder stayed in the closet. I had not opened it since the coffee shop. I didn't need to open it. The information inside it was not going anywhere, and neither was I, and that combination was enough. My father called on a Tuesday in February. I looked at the screen for the duration of the call, and when it went dark, I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished making my coffee. I did not feel guilty. I did not feel righteous either, which was the part that surprised me most. I had expected the not answering to feel like something, like power, or like grief, or like the specific satisfaction of a long overdue correction. What it felt like instead was quiet, the same quiet as the apartment, the same quiet as the Friday dinners with Dana, the same quiet I had been building one small decision at a time since the night I sat in a car in a driveway on Fieldstone Drive and watched the lights of the Murphy house through the window. I was sitting on my balcony the evening I understood that the quiet was not absence. March had come in mild that year, warm enough for a jacket, but not cold enough to drive me inside, and the fig tree in the courtyard had started to bud the building manager's promise, proving itself true, small green beginnings at the tips of the bare branches. The cat was on my lap, doing the specific kind of heavy settling that cats do when they have decided you are not going anywhere. My phone buzzed on the small table beside the chair. My father's name on the screen, catching the last of the evening light. I looked at the screen. I looked at the courtyard, the fig tree with its small green beginnings, the light going from gold to gray at the edges of the sky. I set the phone face down and left it there. The call rang out into the quiet evening. I did not feel the ringing in my chest the way I once would have. I did not perform the not feeling either. I just sat in the chair with the cat on my lap and watched the light change over the courtyard and let the call end on its own, the way things end when you stop holding them open. I had spent 11 years being the person who answered, who showed up, who handled it, who made herself useful enough to earn a seat at a table that had never been built with her in mind. They hadn't hated me when I was helping. They had hated me when I stopped making it easy. And I had stopped. And it had not been easy for them. And I was sitting on a balcony in March, watching a fig tree bud, and my father's call had just rung out into the evening, and the cat was warm and heavy on my lap. And the apartment behind me was mine, every corner of it chosen and paid for and answerable to no one. And I was still here, still standing, still, for the first time in a long time, entirely myself.